I know it's me and then lunch, so let's get after it. I believe the real work of youth ministry is to build mission communities around our middle schools and our high schools. Oh, is that my fault? Okay. A mission community is a group of people who follow Jesus, love each other well, genuinely care for one another, and then they look around and invite kids to participate in that experience. This community is defined by their love of God and of one another, but they just can't help themselves. There is this relentless impulse to go out and invite kids to come in and taste and see this experience. You know this. This is probably your story. You can't help yourselves. You want kids to experience the beauty and the fullness that you know. This mission community is dedicated to practicing with one another the gospel which they hope to proclaim to kids. They practice it themselves and hope to put it on display for kids. The community defined by mission becomes in and of itself the medium by which they get to show people the very thing we talk about. Here's what I mean by that. Let me talk to you about love, and then let me come over here and show you love. Let me teach you forgiveness, and then I'll show you what it looks like when the rubber hits the road. It's hard, but it's beautiful. Come, check it out. Our stories that we tell become embodied, enfleshed, lived out by this community instead of just spoken. A few years back, I had an experience in youth ministry in a community just like this. I sat about 3 rows back in a mostly empty sanctuary. Everyone else had cleared out, and just in front of me and a couple seats over was Cameron's mother. And just in front of her was Cameron's empty casket. Cameron was laying there wearing this ridiculous Chicago Bears t-shirt that this guy wore it to school like once a week. And he was buried in a Chicago Bears t-shirt. I'll never forget that. And he's laying there, and I'm sitting with his mom, eventually sitting next to her, just thinking, what in the world just happened? How did we end up here? How is it that I'm sitting in this empty sanctuary with Cameron's mom, and Cameron's lying in this box? Just outside in the fellowship hall and scattered across the parking lot were hundreds and hundreds of high school kids and youth ministers and the Young Life volunteers that I was there with. We were all shocked by what had happened, saddened and devastated, questioning the goodness of God in the midst of such suffering. Our little community of people doing youth ministry together was hurting badly, but we were there together. We had known Cameron for almost 4 years, and he had just graduated a few weeks earlier. This was in early June. He had just graduated from high school, and Cameron was a wild kid, loved by everyone, especially our group of folks. He was the first kid to show up, the loudest, the most obnoxious, definitely the most inappropriate kid. It was easily one of my favorites. I know we're not supposed to have favorites, but I loved this kid. I had a picture of him on my desk for almost all 4 years of high school and had prayed for him often. There was something about this kid that wanted nothing to do with the gospel, but just kept showing up that drew me to him. Just a few weeks shy of Cameron's graduation, he walked up to me in the courtyard of Pedro Menendez High School in St. Augustine, and he had this big announcement. He was really excited. He's like, Justin, and I'm like, yes, I'm going to camp. I'm like, okay. I think he wanted me to break out into applause, but truth be told, I was really excited because I knew he had just graduated, or was about to graduate, and we were going to have this amazing experience together. And those conversations that take place at camp. I was really excited about getting that kind of uninterrupted time with Cameron. And so we were super excited, and he was thrilled. He said, I want one more experience as a kid before I have to adult. And I was like, all right, well, let's do that together. But just days before we left for camp, he broke his wrist and decided that going to camp with a cast on wouldn't be any fun. We missed having Cameron at camp. Of course, camp was great. And as we ended the week and loaded up on the bus and started to come down the mountain, we passed out the cell phones. And that's when the buzzing began. Just this relentless buzzing. Text message after text message was coming in. Voicemails started to land. And then tears and kind of this whimpering started to come from the back of the bus, and this kind of shock hit everyone on the bus together. We just learned together that Cameron, the night before, had gone to a party and mixed just too many drugs with just too many drinks and died in the arms of a friend while overdosing. It hit while we were on the bus together. Cameron's cousin, Dylan, who I'm still friends with, was on the bus. Many of Cameron's friends were on the bus. And so together we are learning, oh my gosh, this guy who was right in the middle of our community died just a few hours ago. The leaders came up to the front of the bus and began to talk and pray, how are we going to handle this? We're locked in this bus for the next 10 hours. What are we going to do? And so we just said, let's spread out and just be with kids. We prayed, everybody spread out, and it was just a long bus ride home. When we got back, we invited kids to come to my house and just tell stories about Cameron. I invited them to come over and be sad, be happy, to tell stories and laugh, be angry if you need to be angry. Just come and be together. I said, come over around 6, and I told the leaders, why don't you come at 4 and we'll get ready. Well, our leaders showed up at 4. We spent some time praying together, and we're just kind of saying, okay, how are we going to handle this? Probably 20 or 30 kids at least will show up. By 5, not 6, 5, almost 100 kids were there, and we were overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, kids really are wanting to wrestle with this. By 6 o'clock, there was almost 200 kids there, and by 7, the police were there because over 300 kids had shown up. And they were all across the backyard, in the front yard, every room of my house, up and down the street. They were sad. They were telling stories and laughing. They were crying. They were angry. They had questions. It was a beautiful sight. Painful, but beautiful. Cameron's aunt and uncle came. They were there with us for a while. His sister came. I couldn't believe she showed up. She was so brave. It was truly a sacred time. At the end of the night, around 11 o'clock or so, after the last kid left, I sat on the floor of my living room with about 7 other leaders. We were just exhausted. We were whooped. And we just looked at each other and wept and cried. It had just been such an intense night. I'll never forget sitting there, looking into the eyes of these amazing people who were giving their lives away to kids who were suffering. I truly loved these men and women. We had been doing life together. We had played together, worshiped together, been to the high school together, gone to way too many football games and practices together, all of those things. We've been doing life and ministry together. Our love for one another was on display. But our love for one another was not bound up in just being together. It was born out of our shared commitment and calling to ministry at the high school. We were called to one another, yes, we were, but called to one another in such a way that naturally led us to go. And for us to go meant showing up at Pedro Menendez High School. You know these type of people. They can walk alongside lonely kids, popular kids, wild kids, church kids, whatever kind of kid, and they see someone who simply needs to be told how much they are loved by God. I'm that kind of person. You're that kind of person. We can't stand the idea that a kid wouldn't know that God's love for them is far greater than their contempt for themselves. I want them to know that God is here, that God is present, that God loves them, and that Jesus has this really annoying invitation to follow that just won't go away. These are the kind of people we have been given to love and be loved by as we go the way of ministry together. This is the community. This is the kind of community we have been called to be a part of with one another. This is what mission community looks like. Our little team of people doing youth ministry shared in the suffering of all those kids that night. We shared in the suffering of Cameron's family that night and at the funeral and for weeks to come. We spoke of God's presence and love, but then we put that story on display through our actions. So what kind of stories do mission communities tell? The story I just shared about Cameron will forever be etched into my mind and heart, and that's because of Cameron and the stinking Chicago Bears t-shirt and the buzzing on the phone and the hundreds of kids spread out across our street and our lawn and in our house. But it also will be in my mind and heart because I experienced a rich love and fellowship in my mission community that I hadn't really known before. The depth of suffering took us to a new place. The depth of ministry and love took us to a new place. It redefined how I understood ministry to happen, to take place. It spoke of the gospel in a way that no message ever could. So what kind of stories do your mission communities tell? Here's what cracks me up. We know full well that the worst way, a little ironic, the worst way for us to teach or for people to learn is to sit back passively and just receive things thrown at them, right? To be talked at. It's not irony. It's not even like a thing in educational theory anymore. We know this. We've grown. We've learned. And yet, the majority of our proclamation, we think, happens in our messages, in our talks, and in our sermons. So let me ask you this, by show of hands, I do want you to raise your hand. By show of hands, how many of you have been to church in the last 3 or 4 weeks? Oh, good. Okay, good. All right. How many of you can recall the main points of a sermon from 2 weeks ago? Couple hands. Okay, good. How many of you can recall the scripture passages and the main points of a talk given yesterday here? Couple more. Okay, good, fine. Maybe you're an exception to the rule. Here's my point. I was a church-going kid. Actually, just across the street, First Pres Orlando. I grew up here. I was a church-going kid about as much as possible, and I couldn't tell you one thing, it's been a few years, but I couldn't tell you one thing that my youth ministers ever said in a talk. But I remember the other stories that they told. I remember the other stories they told with their lives. These stories weren't talks given up front, but these stories were lived out in front of a watching little punk middle school kid named Justin. I was paying attention, I was listening, and I was testing the boundaries. These stories were told by Neil and Rich and Kristen and Matt and Beamer and Grant and a beautiful cloud of witnesses, a whole bunch of folks that walked with us, that walked with me. Here's what those stories spoke to me. Here's what I heard. Justin, you matter. We notice when you're here. We notice when you're not here. We care about you. We think you're gifted. We think you have something to offer. You are loved by God, and as you follow Jesus, we want to do that with you. Wow. I look back now, and I'm so grateful for this cloud of witnesses to have surrounded me and carried me through such a crazy time of middle school and high school, and to tell me those stories. I'm sitting in a different seat now as a father. Just last night, the reason I wasn't here last night, I was at a middle school information meeting. Oh my gosh. Like, I saw a friend there, and she goes, you talk a big game in youth ministry, but now you're in it. And I'm like, oh no. My son is in 5th grade, this guy, good-looking little dude. And there's nothing I want more than for there to be a mission community of people that love each other, that love Jesus, and invite him to come along with them. Nothing I want more than that. I would give just about anything for that to be true in his life. When it comes to the stories we tell in youth ministry, the mic is never off. Your proclamation doesn't end after a short prayer at the end of a talk. In fact, it may have just begun. The stories you tell are not just the talks you give, but in fact, the stories we tell are found in our lives as we share them with one another and as we share them with kids. 1 Thessalonians 2:8, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives as well. Because we have such a great affection for you, because we care so dearly for you, yes, we share with you the gospel of God, but we share our very lives. We give you ourself. We share the gospel of God, yes, but we give you ourselves. This is the work of mission communities. We have to figure out what it means to give our very selves away. And we need each other to figure this out. This is where we wrestle with what does it mean for our community to be faithful? Our love for kids will lead us. It will drive us to this conversation. Our dear affection for them, the way that we can't stop thinking about them, the way that you walk through the hallways of a school and you have different eyes to see, you know what I mean by that? You have different eyes. You see things that other people don't see. That sort of affection and love will drive us, but we have to do the work of figuring out what does it look like for us to put the rubber on the road here. What does it look like to be present in the lives of these kids we've been called to love and serve? This is the mission side of mission community, collectively giving ourselves away. So back to the empty sanctuary. I'm sitting with Cameron's mother and wondering what in the world is going on. What is happening in this moment? How did I end up here? And I'm praying, asking where God is in the midst of such suffering. But looking back now, I see this beautiful story being told in the midst of this dark experience. There was a great loss and a great sadness, yes, But at the same time, a community of people holding faith for those who couldn't had shown up. They showed up and they were present in the midst of doubt and anger and hurt feelings and sadness, and they simply offered love. They simply offered their very selves. Christ was present with Cameron's family and his friends that day, and one small but significant piece of evidence to that hope was the youth ministers and volunteers that were in the parking lot, sitting with kids in their suffering. That small community of believers were faithful to show up, faithful to hope, faithful to be present, and that faithfulness was born out of their love for one another and for God, but also born out of their shared sense of call, their shared sense of mission, their sentness. And to be sent that day meant showing up in a parking lot and being with a bunch of angry, devastated kids for however long. You know those moments. The mission community held each other that day. They enabled each other to be faithful. And they did that hard work of showing up. What a beautiful story. What a beautiful witness. A story that points to the faithful and present love of God. So, for you and for me, this is our work. We need to be people who build mission communities. As you consider the middle schools you've been given and the high school kids that you love so dearly, I beg you to consider the teams of people you've been called to cultivate in that ministry. Give yourselves to the fellowship of that community. Invest the time and energy in doing life together. Play, celebrate, rest, do the stuff of life. And then let your proclamation of the good news flow out of that love that you have for one another. Let the proclamation of the good news flow out of the love that that internal community has, because together you understand your sentness. Do the hard work of discerning how it is you must give your very selves away, and do that work in a community. May we be youth ministers who build beautiful mission communities that are deeply committed to Jesus Christ, deeply committed to each other, and deeply committed to our clear sense of call to the kids we've been given to love. Amen.